Welcome back to Breakfast Television. Well, the CBC's firing of popular radio host Jian Ghomeshi and the allegations of sexual violence that have followed have been making headlines and dividing Canadians. According to Ghomeshi's Facebook post, he was fired because of his private sex life. One, he explains, includes consensual role play, dominance, and submission. Since then, a Toronto newspaper published interviews with 3 women who allege Ghomeshi physically attacked them without their consent. To explain more about consent, law professor and director of the Centre for Human Rights Research at the U of M, Karen Busby, joins us this morning. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure, Jenna.
To be clear, we're not trying to speculate on guilt or innocence here. We just want to create a bit of a dialogue on consent and what that means, and that's why Karen's here to help us this morning. First of all, let's talk about, we're going to be using the term BDSM. Ghomeshi has referred to that as part of what he enjoys. Let's define what that means. 50 Shades of Grey has helped us a little bit. Let's get your perspective.
Well, BDSM stands for bondage, domination, sadomasochism, and it encompasses a range of activities from tying somebody up to spanking them to engaging in role play to gagging them to a whole number of activities that generally have a sexual element attached to them.
And this is something that both practitioners who are engaging in these acts need to consent to in advance. How does consent work in terms of these relationships?
Well, generally speaking, BDSM practitioners engage in 3 forms of activity that indicate consent. So the first one is they negotiate what's going to happen in the scene. Secondly, they have a safe word, that is, or a safe signal, and when that signal is given, all activity must stop. It's an indication that consent is withdrawn. And finally, they practice what's called the safe, sane, and consensual credo. That is, you don't do anything that is inherently dangerous, that's crazy. So for example, you don't drink a lot before you engage in BDSM because that makes it dangerous because inhibitions are reduced.
And we've also talked about the concept of continuous consent. You mentioned safe words, so this is something that people need to obviously be conscious, need to be able to give consent continuously throughout these encounters.
That's right. So consent must be contemporaneous, it must be given on an occasion, and it has to be continuous. So if it's withdrawn, then the consent ends. So it doesn't continue just because you agreed to engage. You have to always be presently engaging, agreeing to consent in the behavior. So the fact that someone might have consented to BDSM in the past does not mean that they're consenting today to BDSM. It must be continuous and it must be contemporaneous.
In the case of a judge being brought into a case like this, if it were to go to court with opposing viewpoints on how things unfolded, how does a judge come about understanding the dynamic of a relationship like this?
That's actually a great question. I've reviewed every single case on BDSM in the last 20 years. This was a research paper I did a little while ago, and in not one case was expert evidence on BDSM practices tendered in court. So judges have to rely on their own knowledge or make good guesses about what might be appropriate BDSM practices.
And so if we were to go to court with a case, do you look to, if you're building a defense case, do you look to history of violence? Do you look to history of relationship with the complainant? How do you build a case?
What you should be looking for is, was there contemporaneous and continuous consent on this particular occasion? So you would look to, as I've said, scene negotiation, the presence of a safe word or a safe act, and whether or not the acts themselves were safe, sane, and consensual. There are only 2 cases in Canada where clearly consensual BDSM was found to constitute a criminal offense, and that was because in both cases the person died.
What do you want people to take away in terms of the message that is there when it comes to consent in BDSM?
I think the really important message is that in Canada, BDSM practitioners are free to practice the sex that they want to practice as long as consent is always present. That's an important takeaway message. The other message is that defendants sometimes try to trump up BDSM when it wasn't a BDSM relationship to save them from their vicious and violent sexual acts.
So it can be used as a defense in cases of sexual assault.
That's correct.
Thank you so much. We have to leave it there. Unfortunately, we did had a very short time to talk about a very lengthy and serious matter. Thanks so much for joining us, Karen.
My pleasure, Jenna.
Taking a break on Breakfast Television. Stay with us.